coming up on this episode of The Roundtable.
Married people are happier and thrive more and live longer than single people. And so that sex is subordinate to the experience of marriage ultimately. And that's an element of what proper sex education would be. People should know that young women, it's easier to have children when you're young than when you're over 35. And so that you should plan your life accordingly. And so that should be integrated into what people know about themselves. And these truths, they're not readily available. And in fact, the whole sex education, the liberationist sex education, the comprehensive sex education that is offered tries to obscure these facts and tries to deny these facts. And so, I think states could really think through what the goal of proper sex education is. What truths would you like to convey in it?
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of our Cincinnatus series here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams. We're doing this for the next few weeks. We've been doing it now for a few weeks. We hope to offer, especially state legislators across America, with ideas on what exactly to do about family policy, about education, about some of these topics that are in the middle of our current culture war. We'll bring on experts and friends to talk about these things. So we're going to be talking about family policy this week, and I'm joined once again by now veteran of this series, Scott Yenor, my colleague, our senior director of state coalitions at the Center for the American Way of Life, and also a professor at Boise State University. Joined as well by my old friend and old friend of Claremont, Kathleen O'Toole, who's the assistant provost for K through 12 education at Hillsdale College, and also, I should add, relevant for our previous episodes on education. If you want to learn more about the charter school movement and how it's going, what it ought to be doing, go track down Kathleen's appearances across podcasts, both at Hillsdale and elsewhere. She is in her current position, but was also a founding headmaster or headmistress, headmaster.
We
the
said
universal
headmaster,
term. Yeah, of a charter school outside Austin, Texas. But now she's back in Hillsdale. And then finally, Chris Bullivant, Director of Communications for the Institute for Family Studies and Senior Fellow at the Social Capital Campaign. So Scott, Chris, and Kathleen, thanks for joining me. I guess to start with family policy, we'll start with the thing that's on everyone's minds and is front and center, or has been front and center off and on in our national policy discussions. Maybe we can talk a bit about it at the state level, which is, what should the states be doing to encourage and sustain and encourage the flourishing of family formation and maintenance? Maybe Scott, start with you.
Yeah, so I want to start with a little framework for understanding this. That the importance of the law when it comes to family, I think, is very underrated. When you look at over the course of time, the law is what helps sustain family form. So the enduring nature of marriage, how many people enter marriage, how property is held within marriage, are all really important, downstream effects of the law. And we've been living now with laws that are pretty hostile to family life for all of our lives. Divorce, the no-fault divorce revolution happened in the early 70s. Which really affects the overall quality of life. So I think we have to and then the other thing that I think really affects family culture is what I call the indirect elements of public opinion. So So this has to do with ancillary things like how we regulate pornography or how we imagine what a man and a woman's destiny is in the law. And and those also have been very hostile to family life over the course of time. And a lot of what conservatives have done since we've lost the divorce debate and the pornography debate and other debates is try to find other ways of supporting the family. But it seems to me that those are kind of bound not to have that much success. That there really only is the tried and true ways of supporting family life. And trying to preserve or reinstitute a more enduring understanding of marriage as opposed to no fault divorce, I think has to be part of any conservative agenda on preserving the family. And maintaining monogamous marriage as opposed to polygamous marriage has to be part of what conservatives are about. Regulating pornography has to be about what conservatives are about, because all of those cultural elements end up being the most important elements when it comes to preserving family life. And I think the tendency has been to think more in economic terms. I think we should try to support the family economically, but if we ignore the really big cultural aspects of this, I think it's going to be much more difficult, much more uphill battle in order to build a culture that is preserving family life. So my admonition to legislators is that they might have to play small ball for a while, but they have to think big when it comes to changing the laws to change the culture on marriage.
All right. Thanks, Scott. I know, Chris, you've through your work with both organizations, but especially the social capital campaign, have studied a lot of what Scott didn't denigrate, but maybe didn't start off with, which is the economic side of this question. Is there some low-hanging fruit that you see at the state level that ought to be handled differently on just the economic side? And feel free to speak more broadly than that, of course.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think some of it, especially for conservatives when it comes to thinking about family and at the state level, is sort of thinking, well, the government need to not be intruding in family. There's no real role for the government to play in family formation. And so some of it, I think, with Republican legislators is making sure that they understand that there is a role for them to play, even if that role is something of a negative role. I think what we did with the social capital campaign was to borrow from Senator Mike Lee's social capital project. He'd created a series of indices that measured social capital at the state level. And then you could see with that the impact of state policy on things like, the economic stuff, like whether to have a child tax credit or not, whether your tax regime penalizes families or vulnerable families as they sort of get married, and whether there is cultural messaging that they could be reinforcing or reinforcing the wrong messages. So I think there's that. But I think one of the key things that I think both at IFS, Institute for Family Studies, and with the previous work was it is important to know what is the overall story going on in the state and with marriages, because this was actually relatively new to me in moving to the States, but was this idea of this huge marriage divide, that actually it is the wealthy who are getting married and staying married, and those who aren't wealthy just are not getting married in the first place, or their marriages are, or cohabiting is just sort of disintegrating. And all that is doing is creating a sort of a divide that is entrenched, because children that grow up in stable married families see that role model to them, and it's relatively easy for them to do it again. But for those children who grow up not in those sorts of environments, and it's not just their house or their apartment, it's their entire neighborhood, where they're not seeing anything role modeled about stable family formation. And so then they are receiving a lack of role modeling on that front, as well as a lack of cash, a lack of really good education. The divide is sort of getting entrenched. And I think it's that story that state legislators need to pick up on. And to that end, we've helped them by creating at IFS, with the Center for Christian Virtue in Ohio, the Family Structure Index, which ranks all 50 states by how they're doing on that family structure, with Utah doing the best, and Rhode Island ranking 50th.
Huh. That's somewhat surprising. A small, fairly homogenous state. Yeah. Interesting. Kathleen, it's you being here offers a nice opportunity to talk a little bit more about education as a nice follow-up to our last two, but also to take this topic on more broadly. I mean, one of the obvious experiences of running a charter school is interacting with families all the time and their children. Um, what was your experience like in Austin, and what have you learned about this topic from that? And then feel free to say anything you like about the role of education and the importance of it in kind of bolstering and supporting family life.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to have a chance to talk about this because it's strangely, until recently, it was not the first thing that we would talk about when we would talk about education policy. And there was, until recently, I think, the idea that these schools are they know what they're doing. They have some kind of expert knowledge in child education and child development that parents can't be expected to acquire themselves. And so parents should, have some say, of course, but the schools are really populated by the teachers who know the curriculum, who know childhood development, who know best practices for pedagogy. And even in so my school that I founded back in 2014 was pre-COVID, and it was in the north edge of Austin, Texas, which is a pretty school choice friendly state. And the population was family-friendly people, people who stuck together and who, in their marriages, and who took their child's education seriously. And they had taken the step of taking their child out of the public school and putting their child in a charter school. Even in that population, in 2014, it was very difficult to get parents to come to our informational curriculum nights, or get plugged into the actual content of what we were teaching their children. And I remember in the early days of the school, we were having kind of a big assembly and we had hundreds of parents present. And I said, you are the primary educators of your children. And there was like this shudder through the crowd, like everyone shifted in their seats because they had not been spoken to that way ever, much less on school property. And it made them a little bit uncomfortable. They're like, oh, wait, I should have been doing something that I'm not doing now. And so that opened a conversation about, listen, we know how to teach your child math. We know how to teach your child to read. We know a lot of things, but we can't do it unless you're on board. And it doesn't mean giving us your permission merely. It means helping at home, ideally, for the sake of your child. And so we taught them what in loco parentis means. We're here in your stead. You have to give us permission to do this because your child's soul is being formed. Your child's mind is being formed in this place. Well, fast forward to now, and I think you still see a lot of that, but it's a completely different ballgame because of COVID and because of all of this. Let's find out what's actually happening in public schools conversation that's going on, which I think is healthy. And it's putting the decision-making back in parents' laps where it rightly belongs. And parents are kind of rising to the occasion and starting to ask questions. And with all of with the growth of, more school choice options, 18 states have good school choice options now, good legislation that puts the decision about where the child is going to school in the laps of the parents. Parents are getting more educated, and that's much better for their kids.
Yeah. Chris, have you come across any research or sort of social statistics about the link between expanded school choice or educational choice and family formation? I assume it would be positive, but in either direction.
Yeah, I know that in Brad Wilcox's book Get Married, he describes the effect of, I think it's Protestant private schools have the best outcomes for, I think it was something like delaying teen pregnancy or something like that, with perhaps public. I'm a little rusty on this, whether public schools don't do as well on that. Or even Catholic schools, actually, I think don't do very well. It was Protestant schools. So I think with the idea there being that actually what is taught in the culture of the school is important for what is sort of like the choices that people make, which is why we are always keen on promoting the success sequence. The idea that children who do complete a high school education, who work full time in their 20s, and who get married before having children, if you manage to do those three things in that order, 97% of children to adults that do that don't avoid being in poverty. So I think with that, we do think it's important that schools are communicating about relationships and these like simple ideas around, well, simple. I mean, for some people, completing high school is not simple. And so I think it's, I think it is important that schools recognize that, have that in their curriculum, regardless of them. But yeah, there are different types of schools do perform better on this.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just hop in there, Ryan.
Yeah.
It makes lots of logical sense, right? That when you expect more from parents, they have to deliver more. And the whole idea of school choice is really that parents have to own important decisions in their kids' education so that the family has got more to do. Like it's got to be more employed. So it makes sense that more high capacity parents are going to take advantage of school choice or private school, and those who are like aren't used to taking responsibility for a whole family are going to be like less good at this. And so I've been a chairman of the board of a private school here in Meridian, Idaho for over 20 years, and I have lots of data on this stuff. None of our classes have had more than two graduates with divorced parents, really since 2014 when I started keeping stats. Like it's just very rare. So you'll have 40 students, and I tell them never in your life will you have another experience like this where almost everyone that you were around comes from an intact family, and everyone is living with their biological parents. And not everyone, but like it's upwards of 90%. And so in school choice, I think should abet in a way the sorting that Chris talked about, because my suspicion is that it's those who are in intact families who actually want capacity, that is, want to make decisions, want to be responsible for their kids' education, that are the ones who are most likely to take advantage of school choice things. And those who are like lower capacity are going to be less likely to do it. And it is something I think we should talk about as we go forward. Like, what do we do about this divide? Because people from broken families, about 40% of our population, they're our fellow citizens. And so we need to be able to address these capacity issues when it comes to them.
Yeah. I mean, if someone is in school, though, it's because someone loves that child and is taking care of that child. And yeah, instability at home is terrible, and a hurdle, sometimes insurmountable hurdle, but still placing the decision about that child's education, where that child goes to school, in the lap of the person who is with that child, taking care of that child, even if it is a single parent, is a big step.
Yeah. I wanted to address a controversial issue. And I'll say at the outset, I think in talking about this issue more generally, that is our big issue today, not the topic I want to bring up in a minute. Solutions will vary from state to state, obviously. I mean, states have different demographics, they have different socioeconomic divisions. Scott, you're right next door to Utah, which Chris said ranks the highest on some of these indices of social capital. And that'll be a very different experience than you might have in Alabama or Illinois, just to take two maybe different ends of the political spectrum. I wanted to ask about sex education. I think it's unrealistic for a lot of states to expect that they'll restrict it considerably or certainly get rid of it, especially in public schools. I think it's here to stay. But are there ways in which we might reform at the state level sex education so that is? I mean, I know the answer to this in asking it, but I want to get your guys' thoughts to make it more pro-family and more supportive of family formation and maintenance and flourishing.
Yeah,
that's right over the middle of the plate for you, Scott. But I think Chris started talking first, so go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned the success sequence. So I mean, I guess a lot of, in terms of the culture wars, a lot of the stuff that has sort of been all over X is that there's way too much sex education going on in schools, and at too early an age, that seems sort of ideologically driven. that's why I think the on the success sequence that I mentioned earlier, I think it's data driven, and it's sort of relatively neutral on the moral stuff, and it does sort of inform people so that they are kind of equipped to make their own decisions, as it were. I think especially in this absence of, say, relationship education. I mean, for example, my wife was teaching last year in our city's vocational school. And just in terms of like parent involvement, I think she was saying at least 20% of her students, and these were age 17, 18, had no parents at home. Either they had aged out of the care system, or their parents were south of the border. So they were kind of like fending for themselves. So she found them to be actually some of the more responsible students that she was working with. Those who had just one parent, she found to be. This is just purely anecdotal, obviously, and then. But a lot of these kids at the school, in terms of the education that is available to them on relationships, was all about gender identity and sexuality. So when she was trying to get them to think about what will you be doing in 1 year's time, because they're a vocational school, so they're kind of like, what will your car mechanic job look like? They all just started writing about their Grindr or Tinder dates that they were going on. 1 year later, that was kind of like their top priority. So they weren't. Well, so the DEI was probably equipping them brilliantly for that. It wasn't really necessarily equipping them to be able to earn money or to be in stable relationships. But I think on there, and I think it's similarly being hijacked. But the idea of you can do relationship stuff, and from early on, that should really be more about nurture. And I think it was probably the original idea of social and emotional learning. But in the absence of perhaps having really solid relationship role modeling for you in the home environment, there is opportunity for that to be done at school. But that should be really light touch, and it's quite simple, and it shouldn't really be intruding on really personal stuff around your identity or sexuality. But stuff around consent, your personal power, your ability to make a choice in the context of your feelings, those sorts of things. And I've seen a number in the UK, a number of really effective charities that do that go into schools, and non-profits that do that. They are able to go into the school and equip faculty and children alike, students alike, on this thing that has been the good stuff behind social and emotional learning.
Yeah, I mean, let me just weigh in quickly on this, because I think like the first thing we have to recognize is what you're getting at, Ryan, is that there is going to be sex education. I mean, no matter what you're doing as a school, you're going to be teaching boys and girls like what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. You're going to be reinforcing some idea of manhood and womanhood to them, and so we need to kind of take that issue head on and take it away from the liberationist angle and have different outcomes that we would like to see. So, we would like everyone to know that married people are happier and thrive more and live longer than single people. And so that sex is subordinate to the experience of marriage ultimately. And like that's an element of what proper sex education would be. People should know that young women, it's easier to have children when you're young than when you're over 35. And so that you should plan your life accordingly. And so that should be integrated into what people know about themselves. And these truths, they're not readily available. And in fact, the whole sex education, the liberationist sex education, the comprehensive sex education that is offered tries to obscure these facts and tries to deny these facts. And so, I think states could really think through what the goal of proper sex education is. What truths would you like to convey in it? And not make it about the technical act of sex, but rather about where sex fits in in a life well led, in a happy life, in a virtuous life. And so, I think we've seeded this ground, and taking it back would involve articulating a different vision for what family life and where sex fits into family life would really entail.
What was your experience, Kathleen? Did you guys teach sex ed at the charter school outside Austin?
Well, we were in Texas. And we think about where to have a charter school. We have a network of charter schools, and we think about where to have them, focusing on many things, including the health or sex ed requirements in the school and in the state of the school.
We at Hillsdale, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, we at Hillsdale College. I work in the K-12 education office at Hillsdale, which founds classical schools, both charter and private. And so this is an indicator of, the possibility of having an excellent school. We would say to the parents, and many of our schools do this, we're teaching human biology here. And so it will come up in 5th grade because we're teaching human biology. But at that point, we're not going to be getting into any of the moral questions surrounding sex because these children are 5th grade. But we will tell you in advance that this conversation is happening in the classroom. You can sit in if you want to and, expect to talk with your child about it if your child has questions at home. So totally transparent, and giving the families the ability to consent to their children receiving this instruction. We think a lot, all of our schools are co-ed schools. Most American schools are co-ed schools, but boys and girls do need different things. They need a different approach to discipline. Boys need to run around a lot. That's just how they are. And, you need to have a faculty as a school, and you need to have a culture as a school that does not treat them as if they're all just simply the same. We accomplished that by having a dean of girls and a dean of boys. And we would have every other Friday, we'd have at the end of the day, kind of all of the boys would get together and have a study hall together with the male teacher. And sometimes we need to talk about, boy stuff, like y'all are being way too rowdy and making a mess in the hallways. And then we have the same thing for the girls. And they loved that time. They loved being in a room with only girls, and the boys loved being in a room with only boys. And it was good culture building. And so, it's natural. There are 2 sexes, and we do things together, but it's good to do things apart too. And it's good if education policy kind of acknowledges that. It's not just kid versus adult, it's boy versus girl too.
Yeah, I guess a follow-on would be we should encourage state legislators to not be allergic to single-sex education, I should think. Not that I don't think you'll ever, for a variety of reasons, be able to bring it back to public schools anytime soon. But it shouldn't be, I don't know what the state of the culture is out there and how state legislators think about this sort of thing, but the encouragement of single-sex schools, which will mostly be private, or wholly private, should be a goal, I should think.
Yeah. Leonard Sachs is he's a medical doctor who writes on a lot of these cultural issues having to do with boys and girls. And he's got very powerful arguments in favor of single-sex education and a lot of data to back it up. So his last name is S-A-X, Leonard Sachs, if people are interested in learning more about this.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. There's actually space in the law to do public single-sex schools.
Oh, interesting.
And there may be more space coming to do single-sex schools. And, in part, it's because of what Katie's talking about, that boys and girls learn differently, they discipline differently, they actually have slightly different interests. So it's, you can cater their different needs. And we also might want to start thinking about whether or not we want different outcomes, that we actually expect boys and girls to lead slightly different lives, at least over the course of their life. And education should be tailored to that. That argument is not allowed yet. But the goal should be to get that argument allowed. And so yeah, after the VMI, the Virginia Military Institute case in 1996, President Bush created some space for public single-sex schools, and there are more than a handful around the country, probably 3 or 4 dozen. And the outcomes for boys are really good. And because usually they're single-sex boys' schools in public and not, and then single-sex girls' schools exist mostly in private. So I think that actually is, especially in light of that class divide that we were talking about. That is, there may be real ways in rural America or in other, like in the inner city Memphis, to have single-sex boys' schools where instead of being raised in an environment without discipline and without that comes from family life, to have the discipline come from intense schooling that's single sex and can be demanding and disciplinary. And I think raising the quality of men will do something at least to the rural and inner city urban marriage rates and culture. And single sex schools, I think, are one tool that we'd want to use in order to elevate that status of young men.
Yeah, Scott, that just made me think of something. The vast majority of elementary school teachers, middle school teachers, and high school teachers are female, and it's almost all female. If you're talking K through 5, it's rare to find a male teacher who stays in the profession of teaching for a very long time. Now, our schools will have a high percentage of male teachers, and it's because the curriculum is advanced and challenging, and there are a lot of people who considered profession jobs in higher education who didn't want to put up with the nonsense that goes on at universities, but who see a great teaching opportunity in a high school. And so we get these intelligent, well put together, responsible men teaching in our schools. And that is the single most effective way to improve boy culture. And it's not just the high school boys or middle school boys that they're teaching that it affects, because the little boys look up to those middle and high school boys. And so that's so the question is, how do you keep men in teaching? Well, they often have to think about something else after they get married and start having children, because teacher salaries are so low. And it's just not sustainable for many people to remain in teaching through their entire adulthood. They can do it for a couple of years, but anyway, I think that's something that that would make a huge difference, making teaching a sustainable and attractive profession for highly educated people who are great at teaching.
Yeah, and let me bounce in just quick on that, because one of the things you'll see is that in these single sex all male schools, lots of male teachers.
Yeah.
Like, you're talking almost 100% of the teachers. The staff isn't all male, but usually the teaching staff is, and they have decent retention. So if it's important for boys to have male teachers, single sex schools is actually one of the ways in which to accomplish that. And generally public schools have 90% of your grammar schools will be teachers will be female, and about 70% of your upper school teachers will be female, but single sex schools are different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say even in co-ed schools, it's important to have male teachers, because you're developing, the school is a community of people that teaches young children what it is to be a grown-up. And you do that through explicit instruction. These are the things that you need to know in order to be an educated human being, but also implicit. This is how you dress if you're a grown-up going to work. This is how you talk to other people. So if you have a bunch of male role models, that's just as good and essential as having a bunch of great female role models.
Yeah. Chris, I'm sure there are a few things we're missing on the larger social capital front. How should state legislatures be thinking about how to bolster social capital? And give us a quick definition of it to start us off, if you would.
Yeah, well, social capital is the rich network of relationships that any individual has, and so some people think about it as just the person that you can hobnob with to get a promotion at work, or to get your first internship at somewhere very swanky. But actually, it's used to describe those things that are high trust relationships. Tribal relationships, if you will, because we all need a tribe to be stuck in, to be part of, if we're to sort of feel secure in ourselves. And I think, on school choice, for example, the discussion we've had here about single-sex education, I think school choice obviously helps fulfill that, but I think school choice is also exciting, and from a sort of state perspective, because the sort of shriveling up of marriage or family structure is not happening in isolation. A collapse of relationships is actually part of a wider collapse of relationships. so that, and Daniel Aycox at AEI has done some great work on this about the sort of friendship recession, dating recession, the fact that people only find relationships now or friendships within the workspace. They're not finding it at church. They're not finding it in other spots. And some of the pressures, I think, the downward pressures on people being able to have more than one child or any children, the size of family, is to do with the shrinking of the village around people to help them raise their child. So I think one of the things that's interesting to me was Trump's idea about was $10,000 for people who homeschooled or something like that. Some credit, don't quite remember. But I thought that was an interesting idea because I think a lot of the homeschooling networks are an interesting way to rebuild village that wasn't there before. So mums getting together to figure out how they want to sort of like raise community, but they are somehow employed in the school whilst also doing stuff at home is an interesting way to sort of like bridge the need for employment for women and for mums and the preference that women have for part-time jobs so that they can stay at home. But then actually they're also building community that would have been there, in previous decades, isn't there when all the mums or primary caregivers are at work. So I think school choice is a good way to be able to sort of fund that, and by funding those homeschooling networks. So yeah, I think in terms of education and family, that's important. But I think because I just want to say, because on the having a village to raise a child, and I think it was Hillary Clinton who had that book on that name. I think somehow, I don't know how people got captured on this, but people sort of seem to think that means that you can hand your child over to a village. Here, raise this child. But I think any study, whether it's a sort of humanist biologist looking at ant colonies and then comparing them to eusociality of human beings, or whether you're taking a sort of more faith-informed perspective or even if you're just looking at attachment theory, I think that was a relatively novel concept to hand over your child to a completely different group of people, from early infancy. And so I think one of the other things that we may want to be looking at from a social capital perspective is how you can allow families to fulfill their own personal preference, which is to be able to have one of their parents involved in the raising of their children in those early months.
Right. So we would admonish, I think, state legislators to think about school choice alongside the enabling of homeschooling, and
that's where a super child tax credit can be helpful with that. That can perhaps be a more American way of doing achieving some of the results of paid family leave. The issue with paid family leave is it's the government telling you how to structure your life, whereas with child tax credit, it's slightly empowering you to make your own decisions about how you want to do it, and therefore people will then be wanting to stay at home because that's what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, you just hit on something that I think we haven't touched on, but that's really important. For the first 4 years of a child's life, that child needs to be with his or her parents. And we should try to make that easy for people to do. People want to do it, it's hard. You need support, if you've never done it before, but you don't need support from the government. You need a culture that tells you it's okay to want to just sit around with your tiny baby for a while and take care of that baby, because those first 4 years, they become more independent and capable of learning on their own after that. But all they do is receive what you give them, and they soak it up when they're tiny. And parents moms are driven back to work or feel that they need to get back to work in order to show that they're productive or something, and it's the stigma around just like staying at home and being with your baby is huge. And it's a huge obstacle for people.
Mm.
It's a massive area. And I think in terms of policy, I know it's had, it's had its heyday, and then everyone that was supporting that sort of idea, I think, has sort of like recanted and sort of gone in the opposite direction. But I do think it's gone like way too far. But I know that the research that we've done at IFS and surveys show that I think upward of 83% of mums would prefer to be able to and be in part-time work so that they are around for a significant period of time.
Yeah.
And then similarly, I think when we've talked about on the social capital campaign about child tax credit, it's about making sure, especially because typically, or people have children earlier on in their life, although obviously it's still getting later and later. But and when they're not, their earning power is less, and so it's a big hit financially to have a kid, and for some it's kind of like sink or swim. And so I think the idea around, say, a child tax credit is just to sort of maybe make that a little bit more buoyant. But who knows? Maybe with drilling oil and gas being sort of free and price of groceries coming down and no tax on tips. I mean, ideally, we would see a sort of like economic boom that would allow parents to, not need that sort of support. But
Yeah.
in the interim, those sorts of things can help level out what could otherwise be a kind of relatively catastrophic experience, especially for those on lower income.
Yeah.
On that one too, that's where we talk about the elimination of marriage penalties too, so that if you're single, you're checked up with someone, you have a baby, and then you think, okay, let's try and make this right, or we're in love, we want to start a family, this is fantastic, but we get married, and then suddenly our access to SNAP has gone, and actually now we have to pay for this childbirth because our Medicaid is like phased out because we've doubled our income, our household income is now beyond the threshold. So eliminating those marriage tax penalties to bring it in line with the elimination of marriage tax penalties in 2017 for middle class families will just sort of make a bit more of an easier start for people, and a huge cultural signal that actually this is something that is rewarded, that the outcomes that you and your child, as has been mentioned, that you are going to have you will have a better outcomes all around, which we can explore later if you want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned cheaper gas and cheaper groceries, but you didn't talk about our coming phalanx of robot assistants, Chris. Unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, it looks like they'll cost as much as a family car. So we're talking about pretty rarefied space here to do all your house chores, maybe. What about this looming kind of dark cloud across the West of declining fertility? What should states be doing, if anything, to try? I mean, it's an aspect of family formation, an essential one, of course. But how should state legislators be thinking about this? I mean, it seems like a daunting thing to try to fix through lawmaking.
Yeah, so I do think that economic incentives are very difficult to say that they're successful in this. Just to use some kind of baseline things, these numbers are approximate, but like during the Clinton administration, we got our first child tax credit. I think it was $500, and the birth rate was about 2.3 per woman. And then we doubled it under George W. Bush. The birth rate was 2.1. And then I think, doubled it again under President Trump, and the birth rate is 1.7. And that's just kind of like very broad way of looking at it, but I think it's not ultimately easy to use economic incentives to do this unless the economic incentives are really big, because the 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 so-called costs, I don't consider them costs, of having kids, obviously outweighs any tax credit you're going to have. So I think the way I've been thinking about how to use tax credits or things at the state level is that you want to attract the right kind of citizen. So if you have nice, generous benefits for big families, maybe you'll get more big families moving into your state.
Mm-hmm.
And having more people around you from intact big families is what's most likely to kind of change a culture around birth and honoring motherhood. And so I think the state government can do things to honor motherhood. Like some states, I think it's Mongolia has big festivals for people who have their fourth kid. And I'd be happy to have one of those up in Sun Valley, Idaho, if we could arrange that. But maybe even at the ski resort. But I think things like that are great and should be tried. But I think if states looked at their benefit package competitively and tried to attract big families to their states. So I think about something like this, for instance, in Idaho. Let's double the property taxes in Idaho. And then for every kid you have, it goes down 20%. And so if you don't have kids, you're going to be paying really high property taxes. And if you have 4 kids, you're going to be paying 20% of property taxes for the rest of your life. And so it's just a way of like trying to select your citizens, and from that citizen selection, build a different kind of culture in the area, in the states. But I think states can be crucial, but I'm not sure that simply the levers of policy are going to be the things that help you change the behavior of your citizens. They might help you select or attract different kinds. And we've seen this in COVID. We see this in school choice. When people move out of states that have bad policies and they move to states that have good policies. And maybe family could be one of these things that we base that around.
Yeah, I think it's important just to. I think that's right for sure, and I think some of it's like I think it's important to recognize some of the problem that is going on here, because I think some people aren't quite sure just how drastic this fertility decline is. So the replacement rate is 2.1, and I think here in the US we are now at around 1.6, which doesn't sound like that much. But apparently that means the population shrinking by 25% with every generation. So it's actually quite a drastic sort of a shrinkage. And our demographer, Lyman Stone, at IFS, is a bit of a G on this sort of thing and very helpful. And his research shows that you explicitly pro-natalist policies can have an impact. So he did some research looking at pronatalism across Southern Europe, comparing in particular, I think, Spain, France, and Italy. And Spain has had policies in the later 20th century that were more couched in terms of alleviating child poverty, and that did not have much of an impact on pronatalism. Whereas France in the 20th century, I think, had a explicitly "we want you to have more babies" policy approach, and there is um, a a boom in that, and that is not that they do have an increased fertility rate compared to their neighboring countries, which is not based on immigration. So it's not that immigrants have come in and sort of filled up the numbers. It is people who were in France who have had more babies. So and then I think we're about to come out with a report on housing, and that is definitely the housing affordability is one of the biggest prophylactics I think going on. Um, and the marriage culture. So one of the other single biggest determinants of fertility is marriage. So I mean, Elon Musk might have his sort of way of going about making sure that there's lots of babies, but most people can't afford doing child support for 4 separate different families, and let alone the fact that it has hugely negative outcomes in the kid's life. But so I think marriage is also correlated very highly to higher fertility rates. So we're getting around again, but yes, state legislators would be very good to be encouraging marriage, stable families, that gets more kids. And then, yes, apparently everyone, this is a little teaser, everyone would like to have a 3-bedroom single family home. That is the ideal in America. That's what people want. That's what we need to be building. And that's what is holding people back from having babies too.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. The cost of housing is maybe one of the single largest drivers of this phenomenon, I should think, along with like little small things you wouldn't think about, or I'm sure you've thought about them, Chris, because you're enmeshed in this whole process and research. But eliminating if you read about this question, and the libertarians have been good on this, the kind of car seat industry has captured state governments, and they require you to have car seats later and later in life, even though there's really no statistical safety difference once you get past a certain weight. And so people have to buy larger cars, and it's just one of these many small things that restricts people's perceived ability to have larger families.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the housing question, building houses that encourage community among the people in the neighborhood. I mean, today it's very common to move to a family-friendly place, for example, in Texas, and not know your neighbors 3 doors down, because all you do when you're leaving your house is get in the car and you leave your garage, which is attached, and then you're driving. You never walk around. You never see anyone in the front yard. But there are these developments that have like a little splash pad, and so you go to a community pool or something. So, or the front yard is big, so people play in the front yard, not the backyard. And it's set off from the road, and so then people can kind of meet each other and see, hey, I have kids too. And if you're home with toddlers, I speak from experience. You really want to be around another mom who also has toddlers, because they can play, and then you get to sit down for a minute and chat. So it's good to encourage that kind of community, like we did in the 50s.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I have 4 kids in their 20s. They're all married. 3 of them have kids, and my daughter can't have children. She'll be adopting soon. So I can speak to a little bit about what challenges they face. And now this is like relatively family friendly when it comes to culture, and of course they've grown up in the Yenor house. So we've talked to them about this stuff for their whole lives. The 2 like big issues are housing and healthcare. When you are starting out, like otherwise you have to make $150,000 to buy a house and be able to afford your own healthcare. And healthcare costs are crazy, and not every institution has state benefit levels, so that I think the healthcare thing also I would throw in with the housing. And in my view on this, I mean, states are now dominated. Their biggest employers are often hospitals. And it might be a family-friendly policy to go after the monopolies and to back the establishment of kind of concierge services, hospitals, smaller hospitals that you can buy a membership in, and they'll have a staff of doctors, and they can do most of the things that you'll need done when you're 20 and 30. And several places in Idaho have this now. And I think these things kind of flourish, but they flourish. I shouldn't say flourish. They live in existential fear of the monopolies, and knowing that most of the public money goes to supporting these hospitals. So the collusion that ends up existing between the health departments and the 3 or 4 hospital systems that run the states is a real barrier to alternative medicine organizations. Not necessarily just people that give you herbs, but just different ways of organizing healthcare. And so it's not directly a family policy, but it is something that really affects the pocketbook of people who, when they're young and married early and already having kids, have a difficult time imagining having 3 or 4 kids because of the burdens that exist because of that. I think it would be good to break up those monopolies in itself, but it's also a hindrance, just like housing is, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and this question is a big federal question as well.
Yeah.
We've seen in the post-war era, for a variety of reasons, the consolidation of health groups and hospital providers and health insurance groups, but also just an increasingly heavy hand through Medicare and Medicaid of policy mandates and all the rest from the Fed. So not necessarily a state legislature problem, but I'm sure there's plenty that can be done.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about houses is that you buy it, and then like the prices keep going up, and it's actually like a pretty good liability to have, and maybe even an asset. But healthcare is just all sunk cost.
Yeah.
It's like, and it ends up being like not as much as your housing, but more of a worry than your housing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to open the floor. Have we neglected anything we should talk about? I'll encourage everyone. I mean, Chris does a lot of the direct work on this and has already listed some good resources, but I encourage everyone to go to the Institute for Family Studies and investigate more, especially our state legislators. There's lots of great institutions out there. Maybe we could name a few more. I know Scott and Chris, maybe Kathleen, you all know some, but just resources are out there, especially on the kind of nonprofit and research side, which could substitute for often the problem at the state legislature level, which is you don't have 3 or 4 staffers on individual policy topics that you can draw upon.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've got a number of reports that we have looked at very specifically. So just this last week, we produced a report working in Ohio, but looking at family policies that could be implemented there. And we've done similar reports for Texas and Florida, and with Patrick T. Brown and other sunshine states. So that's all available on our site, and we will be continuing with those.
Excellent. Yeah, you mentioned Patrick Brown, an alum of one of the Claremont Institute fellowship programs, I think our Publius Fellowship. So I'd forgotten that. Thanks for mentioning it, Chris.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Patrick has, I think, the best set of economic tax incentive stuff that you'll find in his, I think it was a report from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And so if you're interested in that direction on things, I think his stuff is very good. I mean, the pitch that I would make is that states need to consider divorce reform. There are incremental steps that can be taken away from the fault-based system that we have. It would be great to have 50-50 division of time and resources as the default position in marriage. I think several states have that now. They found that it is a kind of deterrent. For divorce rates have gone down in the places that have adopted those kind of policies. Ending permanent alimony is also something that leads in that direction. A couple of legislators, one in Oklahoma, has proposed, moving to at will, needing both people to say yes to a divorce. A divorce by mutual consent was the old policy before this, or fault-based divorce. And I think that should be the end goal to make marriage a more stable institution so that both men and women feel like they can sink important parts of their identity, their time, their treasure into their marriages. They can stably give up, work part-time and know that the rug isn't going to be pulled out from them. And having a very unstable marriage law creates unstable marriages. And so that's one of the things that I would over the long haul think that needs to be talked about and moved towards.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask Kathleen to tell everyone where they can go to find their local Hillsdale charter school. I'm a happy and proud alum of the college myself. So where should people go to see if they have a Hillsdale charter school near them, Kathleen?
k12.hillsdale.edu. So we help local people found classical schools, both private and charter. And we have lots of resources for parents at K12 at home, k12@home.hillsdale.edu. And the way to think about classical education, it's just the way public education was in this country a couple of generations ago. It's a tried and true approach to teaching and curriculum. And it yields, the best results. Happy, well-educated kids who are far above the state and national standards on all of the things that we measure, like reading and math, but who also know how to learn and who have good, solid characters. And so it's a growing movement, and you can learn more at our website.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. I will encourage everyone as well to go to dc.claremont.org. We have a lot of reports from Scott Yenor, mostly on higher education, but not exclusively, just about the state of affairs in various states and what your, especially public education, the contours of it are like, especially regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, and more ideological slants being pushed by your locals, K through 12 and higher ed systems. So we've reached an hour. So I want to thank you all. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kathleen. I encourage everyone to go to the respective institutions. You got the website from Kathleen. Go to the Institute for Family Studies. Go to dc.claremont.org, like I said. And if you want to support Claremont's work, it makes all this possible. Go to claremont.org/donate and check out our publications too, claremontreviewbooks.com. A wonderful magazine, which Kathleen used to lay out many years ago and is still thriving, and AmericanMind.org, more of our digital daily publication. But thank you all for joining, and join us next week. I think we're talking about cell phone usage in schools and more broadly, and what we ought to do about this digital transformation of our life, which is impacting our children so much as well. We'll talk to you all next week.